Okay, cool. Can everybody hear me at the back? Excellent. Cool. So, yeah, we're going to talk about optimizing front-end workflow. For those of you who are wondering who I am, you've probably never, ever heard of me before at all, ever. But if you use PHP spec, I wrote the extension that allows you to have a dinosaur on your tests. And a crab, and it animates and stuff. It's cool. So yeah, check that out. So yeah, we've got a lot of advances going on in back-end code. So we've got all these things, you know, that we think about, and obviously there's talks about all of these things, there's workshops about all of these things. And the biggest one of those is Composer. Obviously, I presume everybody uses Composer daily. Awesome. But when we look at the front-end code, it's like Back to the Future. You know, we're going back to 1985, and you know, we've got tables and horribleness. But there are loads of cool tools for, you know, optimizing this workflow and doing a better job quicker. So we've got things like Twig and Grunt and Sass and, you know, all these frameworks that allow us to do things quicker. But we don't leverage them in our Symfony apps very often. And there's a gazillion more, obviously, than are on there approximately. But there's a lack of practical examples. So the only examples that I've really seen, I know that Ryan Weaver did a talk on using Grunt. Chris sort of touches on using require.js and that kind of thing. But it's very sad that there's no practical examples. So let's do something about it, and then we can be happy. So the first thing I want to talk about is Twig. Now, Twig is never really talked about. It's just one of those things in Symfony that, you know, you use. But it's really, really powerful. Obviously, it's compiled and cached. But it's always overlooked. It's one of those things we just shove some stuff into some templates and, you know, leave it there. So the first thing I want to talk about is translations. Now, I'm sure most of you probably work on applications that don't really require translations. You know, if you're anything like where I work, we're literally just primarily focused on an English version of the site, which is awesome until somebody comes along and says, can I have a Polish version of this? But they're notoriously messy, and I think that's why a lot of people just leave them until the last minute. But trust me from experience, when you have to go back to an application that has just got a load of hard-coded English strings in your templates, it's the worst thing ever. It's, you know, it's easy to keep them organized. So the first thing you need to do, obviously, in your config.yaml is just turn them on. That's commented out by default. Turn them on. And then in your model, you can do this kind of thing where you just give it a key instead of where you'd usually put a message. Obviously, we're using annotations here, but you could use XML or YAML. You just give it a key. The same there. And then you have a new validators.en.yaml in your translations directory. And these correspond directly to the keys. So what I like to do is have the name of the entity, the property, the validator, and then if there's options for the validator, like the length one might have a min and a max, so you can have different messages for both of those. And then in your form, you can do the same thing. So you just give it another key for the label of the form. And then in a forms.en.yaml, you can do the same thing. But forms.en.yaml isn't standard. The validators one just works out of the box. It's just cool, it just works. But the forms one doesn't. So the way you get around that is in your form type is just add this translation domain, which will then automatically work. It's just cool. It's just like that. It just works. But when they don't work, clear the cache. You wouldn't believe the amount of hours I've spent trying to debug a translation that's just not appearing, and it's because the cache hasn't been cleared. Even in the dev environment. So if you add a new translation file, it won't pick that up. And translate everything. Translate all your titles, all the actions of your buttons, single words, because it's really, really horrible to go back and try and do that after. And then, obviously, on Talk Like a Pirate Day, you can have a pirate version of your translations. And it gives you translations per section of your app. You can organize them however you like. So a lot of the apps we do have obviously got a front end and a back end, and you might want different representations of properties depending on where you are in the application. So what we do to organize that is we have like an admin YAML file that will have certain things. And then in the template for the admin, we can do these kind of things and give it a specific file to read that translation from, which works really well, but it's messy. So one of the things that obviously I'm sure we all use is template inheritance. So we've got a default base template in Symfony, which looks like this. But the problem with this is it's not really optimal for modern development. So if you use anything like HTML5 boilerplate or any of the other sort of template frameworks, it looks more like this, which does actually give us a more flexible foundation to build on. So how many people have the same HTML structure and assets per section of your app? So you might have like an account area, or you might have a back end, or you might have some public-facing front end. We definitely don't. Our HTML structure is completely different. We have different blocks that we want to use. I presume that's the same for most people here. It's like some people nodding. So what we do to combat this is we have a new layouts directory in our project, which we have, the base template is just in the app directory, so you've got app resources, we have the base template there, and then we have new layouts for each section of the app. And to do that, we just add the extends. So what we do in the base template, we've got a content block, which is obviously non-standard. The default base template gives you a body block. So we change that to content, which means that in these different sections, we can have different blocks of content. So in the admin, we may not have a header, for example, or we might not have a footer. We might just want to blat some stuff onto the screen. But in the front end, we might have a header and a body and a footer, which means that we can just change the extends in these templates depending on which section they belong to. So for this one, this is something to do with the admin. It's just a list of articles. And what that gives us is a flexible base to build on. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. And this is just something that's come up from us trying to, we've got a system at work where we have different themes per affiliate, and we have to theme up the whole application depending on, which affiliate's coming in and stuff like that. But it means that all your boilerplate code is dry. You only do that once in the base template, and then everything else just uses that. And it means you can have defaults per section. So in the title block, for example, in the front end, you might have a different title than in the admin, which you don't have to override in your templates if you don't want to, but you can do. So the other thing I want to talk about is trans default domain, which basically, in the examples we had before, we had the trans and then it said admin. You can actually set that completely in the template there. And then when it comes to these things here, you don't have to do that, which tidies it up a little bit. It's easier to then go and change it to use a completely different file if you want to. But we've got template inheritance going on. So in your section, if you're going to say all your translations are in, for this section, are in this admin YAML file, why don't we just do this in the layout? It doesn't work. Okay, so basically, the trans default domain doesn't propagate down the inheritance tree. So you have to do that in every template. And it's never going to be fixed. There was a ticket about it on the Twig repository, and Fabian just said, you know, this is never going to be fixed. But never mind. So the next thing I want to talk about is Node.js. I presume everybody's used Node.js. So you've got server-side JavaScript, which obviously adds extra functionality. And the cool thing about Node.js is once you've installed it, you've got npm, which is essentially Composer for Node. And you can install that globally on your machine, or you can install it just into your project, which is super cool. And one of those things that you can install with npm is Bower. So has anybody used Bower? Cool. So you go to the website and it tells you, right, cool, let's install Bower. This is how you do it. So we're going to install it globally, and it fails. So the actual official talks, you do what it says, and it just doesn't work. Not cool. So you need to use sudo to install it globally. And then once you've done that, it basically goes and installs the internet on your computer. And you sit there and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And eventually, it does actually install a new command line tool, which is now available globally on your machine. So you can see that obviously you can just use Bower from the command line now, which is awesome. So how do you get stuff into your project with Bower? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to find the dependency that you need. So for this example, we're going to look at Modernizer. So you do Bower search, Modernizer. It comes back, tells you the names of the repositories that you can get. Obviously, you know, there's lots of different versions. So you can have the CSS pointer events or whatever. And then to install the dependencies in your project, you literally just do Bower install whatever the dependency is called. So for this example, Modernizer, it goes away, it does it, it's there. And then we end up with this new directory called Bower components. And inside that is a directory for Modernizer. And inside that is all this stuff for Modernizer. Now, generally, you get an uncompressed version. So we'll talk about that later. But having this Bower components directory isn't really great, because if you forget to, for example, put that in your git ignore, you're committing stuff that you don't want to commit. Obviously, you don't commit the vendor directory for Symfony. You don't really want to be doing the same for this kind of stuff. So there's a file called Bower RC. And literally, in the Bower RC file, you can't see the end, but you just have a directory key. It's just a JSON file. So here we're going to put it in web vendor. No, obviously, that's up to you. But when you install again, you end up with a new directory in web. So you get web vendor. And that contains the thing that you want. You can see there that it's installed into web vendor modernizer, which is cool, which is better. It's less messy in your projects, it's less noise in your directory tree, in your IDE or whatever. But you can move that elsewhere. So don't think that you just have to put it in the web directory or in the Bower components directory. You can put it wherever you want. So yeah, I said that obviously this is, NPM was like Composer for Node. Bower is like Composer for anything, basically. So front-end, tools, frameworks, that kind of thing. So you have a bower.json file in your project, which the first thing you need to do is create a file which has just got the name of your project. If you don't have the name of your project, it doesn't work. I don't know why, it just doesn't work. So you go for the bower.json. When you then install, you can save the dependencies. So you've got save dev, which will just save it, and you can use that in your development environment. But you've also got save, which does it globally. The same as Composer, where you've got a dev and a production version. And you can see that obviously it just puts it there with a version number. But wherever you install these assets, don't forget to put them in your .git ignore, because you don't want to be committing them. So to use that in Symfony, once you've installed it, in your JavaScript block, or however you usually include JavaScript, you literally just change the asset path to point to somewhere relative to the web directory. And again, that can be globally or per section. So you can have different JavaScript dependencies depending on where you are in the application. So for example, in our front end, we might need Modernizer, but in the back end, we don't really care because we're in control of the people who are using that and what machines they're using that on. So you can put stuff in different locations, which is fine, but that's a non-standard install, and you have to remember that that's a non-standard install, because if there's other people using it, you want to make it clear to them that that's what's going to happen. But the benefit of that is it's potentially more flexible. So we've got another cool tool, which is Gulp. Has everybody used Gulp or Grunt? Yeah, cool. So Gulp is like an easier version of Grunt that has got less configuration. So let's take a look at that. It's just a build tool. So yeah, somebody tweeted this, that every week someone who doesn't understand make writes a new build system in JavaScript, which is probably true. So you got like Grunt.js, Gear.js, Gulp.js, and Broccoli.js. I don't know if that exists. I think somebody just made that up. Just take any vegetable name and put JS on the end. That's cool. The good thing about Gulp is it's a streaming build system, so you can have streams of files that you act on. And it's got a plugin architecture. So you literally, let's say you want to compile Sass, for example. You go to the thing, you find a thing that compiles Sass, you install it in your project, it just works. So yeah, the thing to get this working is you do the sudo npm install globally Gulp. One of the things we found is that when you're installing Gulp, you have to install it globally and in your project. If it's just global, the paths are wrong, and then it won't work properly. So again, it just goes away, installs the stuff that Gulp needs, which is not as much, even though it takes forever. And then once you've done that, you've got a new Gulp command line tool that you can use. But there's one extra step. Because when you're deploying these applications, you need to make sure that you've got all these things, all these tools on your server. So to do that, what we do is we've got a package.json, which is like the npm version of composer.json. We can save dependencies the same way, just save dev or save. And then that puts it in that package.json. So all you need to do when you get a fresh checkout of the project is do an npm install. And it'll install Gulp as you need. Again, don't forget your .git ignore, because that puts everything in a node modules directory. It would be really, really cool if you could change that directory, but you can't. npm will only allow you to install in this node modules directory. So let's take some examples of how we can use this in Symfony. So one of the things that we probably all do is minify JavaScript. So I mentioned before, we've installed Modernizer. That's just an uncompressed version. So we're going to install Gulp. There's a tool called Gulp Uglify, which again is just a wrapper around Uglify for Gulp. And then you have a Gulp file.js, which is the same as your grunt file.js. It's the same thing. And then to do that, you basically, I'll just tell you. So yeah, basically what you do is you import those things with a require. So the individual modules, you get a Gulp, you get a Gulp utils, which the documentation says you have to install. You don't. That's a lie. You don't need that unless you're using specific things from that. You install the Uglify, and then you pipe, you set a source of where you want these files to come from. You pipe that through whatever filters you want, and then you pipe it to a destination, which will just output the file. So we could actually go back and have a look at that. So the good thing about the plugins as well for Gulp is they're really small. It doesn't take long to install them. Okay, so this just illustrates what I was saying before. So you need a variable for Gulp just to be able to do it. The same with the Gulp utils. I've left it in here because it says you need it in the docs. You get a copy of the Uglify, you import. And then you have tasks. So we're going to set up a JavaScript task, which is just going to be responsible for minifying JavaScript. You give that an anonymous function. So you get a gulp.source, which is wherever you want. So for this example, web vendor modernizer, modernizer.js. You then pipe that through the Uglify. And then you pipe it to a destination. So you can see that this thing just goes through this pipeline of things that you want it to do. So we're going to output it into web.js vendor. So we should end up with a minified version of Modernizer in web.js vendor. So you can see that it's finished that task. And we end up with a minified version, which is really cool because you can have multiple sources, so you can concat things really easily. Cool. So to then use it in a Symfony project, all you need to do is to change that asset path to wherever the compile version now lives. But there's a problem. We've got two copies now in web. We've got the ones that we installed with Bower, and we've also got the ones that we've just processed, which is probably not what we want. So what we've been doing at work, and this is something that I've had some conversations about, whether it's a good idea or not, we actually install all our Bower dependencies into the vendor directory. So we install into vendor/Bower. The only problem with that is that you could end up with a conflict. If you were installing something with Composer that potentially was installing stuff into a Bower directory, I'm not sure why you would, but there's a potential for that to clash. That could be a problem. So what we like to do is in your composer.json, you can set where the vendor directory is. So we have /vendor/composer for anything that's installed with Composer. We have /vendor/Bower for anything that's installed with Bower. We would do the same with Node, but we can't. Which means you then also don't have to worry about the .git ignore, because obviously you're not committing your vendor directory anyway. And it prevents your source files from being public. So none of the files that you're actually pulling in as dependencies are now public. You can't access them on your web server because they're in the vendor directory. You can still compile into the web directory, obviously, so that you can access it. So one of the other things is like SCSS. Does anybody use sort of like preprocessors? Yeah, cool. So it's just a completely normal SCSS workflow with this kind of thing. You don't have to make any changes to what you're doing. So you might have a SCSS that's pulling in something that you're, normalized that you can install with Gulp. You don't have to copy that into your project anymore. You can always guarantee that you've got the latest version. Standard SCSS file in your Gulp file require a SAS compiler, which you've got a task that just looks for any CSS files, SCSS files in asset CSS, pipes them through that, puts them somewhere else. It's really, really simple. And then in your HTML, you just reference the compiled version, compile them on the command line, and it's awesome. So it's really, really simple. But running all these commands in the terminal gets solved really, really quickly. Okay, so you can set up watching. So in your Gulp file, you can have a task called watch, which is an inbuilt Gulp function. So you can say watch for any changes to these SCSS files in these directories and run these tasks. So let's have a quick example of that. So we've set that task up, we're watching, make some changes to the file, save it, it's automatically run the SCSS task. So you can have things like live reload. There's plugins for Gulp that do live reload, so as soon as you save it, you're seeing the result in the browser. It's awesome. Cool, but we're only scratching the surface. There's so many other stuff you can do. There's Gulp plugins for everything. So, if you want to minify HTML or you want to minify templates, that's no problem. It'll allow you to do that. And you can do custom actions. So if you've got tests in your project, every time you save a test, you could get it to run the tests. Whether that's front end or back end, you can use it for both. But setting up a project can be tedious, obviously. Running all these commands, you check out a project, you need to do npm install, you need to do Bower install, you need to do all the other installs. But you can take that much further. You can, what we do at work when we deploy, we've got a custom Symfony task that will run all these things on the server, or you could do it in a Composer post-install script. So literally all you're doing is just running your Composer install, but it does all these things for you. There's millions of tools available, but don't use all of them because it gets really, really slow, really quick. You just have to plan it. That's terrible. I don't know why I did that joke. Cool. So yeah, so any questions about anything? Yeah, cool.
So you're talking about the translations.
Yeah.
You said having an admin.
Hang on, can we just use the microphone and then everyone can hear your question and it can be recorded? I'll just bring it over. We've got 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there. Yes, with the translations, you had an admin translation file,
yeah.
And then you had like a default or a general for the kind of public-facing side. Do they both have to be the same, or can one kind of essentially extend from the other? Could you, if there's not a translation in the admin, would it look to the default? Can it be set up in that way?
Yeah. So built into Symfony, there's no way to do that. The translation component won't fall back to another translation file. It will literally, if it can't find the key in the translation file that you specify, it'll just print out the key. So the way around that is, because we had the same thing where I work, obviously these affiliates have all got their own translation files, but there's some stuff that's global to everything. So the only way to do that is to implement a custom translation service. So basically what we did is we copied the code out of the translation that's in Symfony, because there's no built-in way to override that, registered it as a new service and set that as the translator.
All right, cool. Cheers, thanks.
So there's a way around it, but it's not built in. Cool. Is there any other questions? Cool.
Just to that, actually, I'm from a Rails background actually originally, and that might be something you can do in YAML itself. Like it allows you to kind of say, oh, inherit all the properties from this other thing. I don't think it's going to work cross-file, but if you manage it like that. But my actual question is about, I've not really played with Gulp much, and one of the things that's kind of important is, busting cache when you make changes. Is it possible to do stuff like, like having a hash at the end of the URLs? Can it automatically handle that kind of stuff for you? Yeah, absolutely. So aesthetic allows you to bust the cache. As long as you use the asset tag, there's a configuration option in your config.yaml where you can set a versioning scheme. And basically, if you change that, it will then bust the cache and append something. There's also a Epiphany task which you can enable that will do that automatically on deploy, so that every time you deploy, you get a new version, which can use like the GitHub commit hash. Thanks. Anyone else? Cool.
How do you feel that Gulp compares to Grunt?
Okay, so as far as Grunt goes, I tried learning Grunt, and I found that my files got really big really quick. So to do something like minify in JavaScript, it's definitely more than 3 lines of code. So I think that Grunt sort of abstracts away some of that complexity. And I think it's easier to get started with Gulp. And also we make extensive use of like streams and stuff at work so that we can optimize how these things are processed.
Did you notice a performance increase with Gulp if you're doing quite a lot of operations?
Yeah, so if we're doing a lot of operations, it gets really slow really quickly if you're just doing it in the task-based approach. But you can use streams that basically take a load of files and you can treat those as one thing, which does give a massive performance benefit. And you can split up the tasks into different files really easily. So, cool. Cool. Someone else?
Can you use Bower, when you install things with Bower, can you lock dependencies similar to composer.lock?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can specify, it's the same versioning scheme in the file, so you can absolutely do that. So you can pin it to a specific version of a dependency.
And are you using, is it shrink wrap in NPM? Is it similar for that?
Say that again, sorry?
In NPM, is there something, is it called shrink wrap? I haven't used it, but I've heard of it.
I'm not sure.
For the same thing, because I'm always worried when you deploy things, you don't want to be deploying the latest version compared to development. So
originally we were doing exactly that. We were just saving it, and it was just doing new versions, and then we'd get a report, oh, this browser's broken. So yeah, we do lock the versions. I'm pretty sure you can do that in NPM actually. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else? No? Cool. Well, thanks very much. I'm on Twitter. Also joined in. If you could leave some feedback, that would be awesome, because this is the first time I've done this. But yeah, that's great. Thanks very much.